So we're still here in Exeter. This is our second visit to, which is known as Rhode Island Historical Cemetery number 14, or the Stuckley Tillinghast family plot. And it's rather hard to find. In fact, if you're driving past it, you will drive past it. You have to look very intently for the sign there. So we're going to zero in on it. It's a very small plot. In fact, as I refer to my notes, it's about 50 by 50 in size, and I'll show you the extent of it. The stone wall here kind of marks the front boundary. There's no back boundary here. From the database, it says there are 25 burials here, 15 with inscriptions, and the inscriptions are all from 1831 to 1919. However, many of the inscriptions, many of the stones, I should say, don't have inscriptions, and there's a reason why. So let's come around and talk about the vampire legend that was the blight of the Tillinghast family. And there are quite a few Tillinghasts in Rhode Island, as we've seen over the course of our not our ventures, but of course of our visits. So the story begins with a very modest, again, and like the case of George Brown, very modest and humble farmer named Stuckley Tillinghast. And Stutley or Stuckley, I've heard it both ways. From the inscription here, it says Stutley. He was referred to as Snuffy. He was a peach and apple grower, and he sold his wares around the state. Contemporary, you see that he died in 1848. The events that we're chronicling occurred in 1799 to 1800. So he had a very large family. In fact, over the course of his life, he and his wife Honor, who is buried just over here, had a total of 14 children. And here's the grave of Honor, wife of Stutley. She died in 1831. She died before her husband, about 11 years or so, if my arithmetic is right. So this is the parents, Honor, and we'll call him Snuffy. So 14 children, and he ran a very large apple orchard. And really the problems began to develop in the harvest season of 1799, and I'm relying on Christopher Rodina's book, Vampires in New England, for much of the details here. Apparently, Snuffy Tillinghast had a really terrible nightmare. In the course of the nightmare, he heard his daughter Sarah calling to him, and he looked around and he literally watched his orchard just disintegrate in front of him. In fact, according to Rodina, he stood back, and as he watched the leaves turn brown and the fruit rot, he saw nearly half of his orchard was dead, and there was no sign of his daughter, only a call of her voice. He went to see the local pastor, I should say, Benjamin Northrop, and who reassured him that, these are just nightmares and not something to worry about. But the problems for the Tillinghast family would only just begin. His eldest daughter, Sarah, who was 19 in the year 1799, she began coming down with sickness. In fact, she grew very ill, and within a matter of weeks, she died of what was referred to as consumption. And that's what the doctor's diagnosis was. We have no way of determining whether an autopsy was done or not. Now the family was buried, the children were buried. I'm assuming these unmarked graves right here, these have to be it. Among the poorer sect in the family, among poorer families I should say, most of the headstones would lack an inscription. In fact, it would just have a marker to denote where people had died. And there were a total of, this one right here, I'm sorry to tap that with my foot, that's a little disrespectful, so I'll give it a little pat here. We can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's 2 more behind me, that's 10, 11, 12, 13. There, you can make a case of 14, possibly, perhaps 14, where the children. We don't know which one Sarah is buried in. She was buried after she died, immediately. Now, the story gets a little macabre here when a few weeks after Sarah died, James, who was the youngest brother in the Tillinghast family, he came down with the same symptoms as his sister. In fact, he came down into the kitchen one day and he complained that his chest hurt. The story that he told his parents, his mother in particular, was that Sarah had come to him and touched him right in the area above the heart. And, that, of course, frightened the parents, frightened Honor. But she didn't make much of it. She had just thought, he had a tummy ache or something. But it turns out that these were the first symptoms of the tuberculosis bacterium starting to affect his pulmonary abilities, but pulmonary system, I should say. And things began to get worse. James died very quickly, within a few weeks. Grew very weak, he faded, and the mother couldn't help but remember the words that Sarah had touched him. And then the symptoms started and he died. 2 girls followed, Andris, who was 14, and Ruth, who was next eldest to Sarah. She succumbed also. They grew very sick. And they told their parents, again, another very bizarre story. It makes me wonder whether or not James had mentioned the story of Sarah to both the sisters. But anyway, Andris told the mother, Andris and Ruth were talking about, that he went to open the window and he could hear it clearly. He noticed Sarah standing in the yard below. She called to me, and then she was in the room, though I don't recall how she got there. Ruth told the family that Sarah came in, stood over the bed, and leaned over her. She couldn't see her face, but the voice was most definitely Sarah's, and said she missed me, she was very cold, and needed to be warm. Sarah hugged me, Mama, Ruth said, but she squeezed so tight I couldn't breathe. In a matter of months, both girls were gone, and they were buried in this spot in the Tillinghast family plot here. So things looked bad. That's those 4 children that he had lost, and it would continue to get worse. One daughter was Hannah, and she was 26 years old. She was from West Greenwich, and she was living in West Greenwich, and she was actually married, and she actually started to talk about dreams that she was having. She actually argued with some of her sisters who told her to stay away because of what was going on in the family. In fact, it was the mother who said, you mustn't come visit us. There's evil haunting us. That's what Honor told her sister. Honor told her daughter, Hannah. But the daughter thought it was foolish. But she chalked it up to nightmares. But soon enough, in the spring of 1800, Hannah came down and contracted tuberculosis and died. So it's a question, really an open question here, whether or not, whether or not how much the virus was spreading, the bacteria was spreading in the house. It's very possible that because this was a very small family, that the children were sleeping in the same bed, and as they slept in the same bed, they contracted the disease very quickly here. Just looking at some of the other graves here. HT, that could be Honor. Tillinghast here. You see a number of them are actually missing here, and many of them are just unscribed. So Hannah succumbed in H could be Hannah in spring of 1800. I'm sorry, I'm getting bit by mosquitoes. Urza was the last. Urza was a 17-year-old son, and he was the last one to contract it. And at that point, even the strong-willed and humble father began to think that perhaps this isn't Sarah Tilinghast. This is a woman who married Clark Tillinghast, one of the other members of the immediate family. But even the father began to start to believe in these tales. In fact, he had a friend named Jeremiah Dandridge who came over and told him that in other towns these things were happening. He talked about an episode in Richmond in which the dead were coming in dreams and tormenting the living, and he causing several of them to die. And this paralleled what happened, seemed to be paralleling what was happening in the Tillinghast family. In fact, Urza had a similar tale too, of being visited by Sarah, and this really set off Snuffy Tillinghast. He decided to take matters in his own hands even before Urza had been put in the ground. He grabbed 2 farmhands. They went out to the cemetery, right where we're standing right now. He took 2 farmhands, and he dug up the bodies of his children one by one. They were laid in wooden boxes. He pulled the boxes out, and he examined the bodies to see, whether or not there's any evidence that they could have been, acting from beyond the grave. For the most part, all the bodies looked like they were decaying, as they should. The only exception was Sarah's. When he pulled Sarah's box from the ground, he literally stood aghast. She looked as she was resting. Her body looked flush and vital in the amber glow of the late day. Her eyes were open, staring at the darkening sky. And one of the farmhands just dropped to his knees and clasped his hands together in prayer after seeing the state of her body. Snuffy pulled out a knife, and he actually he pulled the body away, and he pulled out and cut out his daughter's heart. Took out a flask of oil, and he burned it. He held out the dark-stained hand for the flask of oil, then poured flint and tinder from his coat pocket. He poured the oil in a small reddish lump that lay on the grass, striking a flame to the tinder. Tillinghast watched as his daughter's heart burned to ash. And they thought that this was the remedy. This was what would exorcise the evil that was inflicting the household. Urza did die, and after this ritual was performed, it was generally thought that he was just too far along in his disease to stop it. So they went, the Tillinghasts were really resilient people. Both father and mother did survive. They went on to have other children, a total of 14, according to Mr. Rodina. And of the 14, 7 had died, half of his flock. And this seemed to parallel the story, or the nightmare that he had, where he had lost half of his orchard to the whispering voice of Sarah. So it's a beautiful, it's not a beautiful story, but the legend has a poetry to it. It's a macabre poetry. It's a dark poem, but there's you can see where people would resonate with people who truly believed in vampires. But what was going on, of course, was the death, the spread of tuberculosis, again, through this area of rural Rhode Island. This site is only about 2.5 miles down the road from the Mercy Brown Cemetery. So these families could have been living very, very close to one another. You can see that there are other Tillinghasts buried in this cemetery here. And these stones right here with no markings at all. These are the children. These are the 6 children that died. There was a 7th who died unrelated to the actual outbreak. But the 6 who did die here are buried in this cemetery here, near their father and mother. This is one of the first cases of vampirism in the state. I think Abigail Staples, 1796, we looked at that one in Cumberland, predates this a little bit, and we saw that wonderful cemetery there. So if you're coming and looking for this one, this is a little hard to find, a little easier than the Jenks Road, the Nancy Young case, but nonetheless. And I hope you enjoy the Steadicam this time. My first expedition over here was blighted by a shaky hand and eyes down to the notes, but things are much smoother this time. So this is DevilsHopyard.com. We're signing off now from the Tillinghast family plot.